What would make a flight attendant slap a passenger mid-flight? And why, just 2 minutes later, did her boss fire her without a second thought? This shocking incident took everyone by surprise, but the truth behind it is even more unbelievable. Stick around, because what you're about to hear will make you question everything. Before we start the story, comment below and let us know where you're watching from today. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to hit subscribe for more shocking stories just like this. Aboard Flight 347, the atmosphere was anything but ordinary. The plane had just taken off from a busy airport, heading towards its destination. Passengers were settling into their seats, some looking out of the windows, others flipping through magazines or scrolling through their phones. It was a typical flight, or so it seemed. But then, an incident occurred that would shake the flight crew and the passengers to their core, leaving everyone questioning what they had just witnessed. It all started when a disagreement broke out between a passenger and one of the flight attendants. The man, a middle-aged black passenger, had politely asked the flight attendant if he could switch seats. Apparently, there had been an issue with his assigned spot, and he wanted to move to a different location on the plane. It seemed like a simple enough request, but the flight attendant, visibly irritated, didn't take kindly to his tone. The conversation quickly escalated. The passenger raised his voice, trying to explain his situation, but the flight attendant's patience seemed to wear thin. The tension in the air was palpable, as other passengers began to notice the growing conflict. Some of them even turned to watch, sensing that something wasn't right. The flight attendant snapped, saying something that only made the situation worse. The words exchanged were heated, but what happened next was even more shocking. Without warning, the flight attendant, in a moment of pure frustration, slapped the passenger across the face. The sound echoed through the cabin, silencing the murmurs and turning all eyes toward the front of the plane. In that instant, it felt like time stopped. Everyone stared in disbelief at what had just happened. The passenger, stunned by the sudden blow, stood frozen in his seat, his hand clutching his face. The flight attendant, equally shocked by her own actions, stood there for a moment, seemingly unsure of what to do next. A hush fell over the plane, and for a brief moment no one moved. It wasn't just a slap. It was a moment that none of them would ever forget. But this was only the beginning. What happened next would leave the entire flight in shock, as the situation took an even more unexpected turn. The slap seemed to freeze everyone in place. Passengers looked around at each other in disbelief, unsure whether they had really seen what just happened. The flight attendant stepped back, her face pale and her hand trembling slightly. The passenger, still shocked by the blow, slowly stood up, his hand still pressed to his cheek. His eyes were wide, and for a moment, it looked like he didn't know whether to speak or stay silent. The rest of the cabin was eerily quiet, with only the sound of the plane's engines humming in the background. The flight crew quickly scrambled into action. Another flight attendant, who had been working in a different section, rushed over to try and calm the situation down. She gently placed a hand on the shoulder of the passenger, asking if he was okay. But the damage was done. The tension in the air had reached its peak, and no one could ignore the fact that something deeply inappropriate had just happened on board. The passengers who had witnessed the scene were now whispering among themselves, exchanging confused glances. Some were angry, others were just shocked. One elderly woman near the back of the plane whispered to her husband, "Did she just slap him?" A few others nodded, their faces reflecting the same disbelief. It wasn't just the slap that shocked everyone. It was the fact that a flight attendant, someone trained to remain calm in such situations, had reacted with such aggression. The flight attendant who had slapped the passenger seemed to realize that things were spiraling out of control. She muttered an apology, but it sounded more like an afterthought. The passenger, still in a daze, remained silent for a moment, then quietly demanded to speak to the supervisor. His voice wasn't loud, but there was an edge to it now. The apology didn't feel like enough to him. He wasn't sure what he was expecting. Perhaps an explanation, perhaps an acknowledgement that he was treated unfairly. But what he didn't know was that just a few minutes later, things would take an even more unexpected turn. As the plane continued its flight, The atmosphere was tense. The passenger, still holding his cheek where the slap had landed, was escorted to the back of the plane. The flight attendant, who had slapped him, seemed to keep her distance, but her nervous glances toward him didn't go unnoticed. A few passengers were still talking quietly about the incident, exchanging theories about what had triggered such an extreme response. The flight crew worked in silence, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. It was as though everyone on the plane was waiting for something to happen, but no one knew exactly what that something would be. At the same time, the passenger was beginning to calm down. He sat quietly in one of the back seats, his hand still resting on his face. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just occurred. Why had the flight attendant reacted that way? What had he done to provoke her? He had simply asked for a seat change, something that seemed so trivial at the time. But now it felt like everything had spiraled out of control in the blink of an eye. As the flight continued, word of the incident started to spread among the crew. The captain and the senior staff were informed of what had happened, and they immediately began to discuss what needed to be done. Meanwhile, the flight attendant who had slapped the passenger seemed to realize that this wasn't something that could just be swept under the rug. She must have known that her actions would not be tolerated, but she was probably hoping the situation would just blow over. But deep down, she knew it wouldn't. It wasn't long before the decision was made. The airline had a policy in place for handling incidents like this, and there was no room for leniency. The supervisor, who had been alerted to the situation, was already preparing to meet the flight at its destination. She would be waiting at the gate when they landed, ready to address the matter. What happened next would change everything for the flight attendant. As soon as the plane touched down and the passengers began to disembark, the flight crew was informed of the decision. The moment they landed, the boss was waiting by the gate, ready to take immediate action. The slap wasn't just an isolated incident. It had sparked something bigger, and there was no turning back now. As the passengers disembarked, the mood was far from the usual casual bustle. People moved quickly, trying to exit the plane and avoid drawing attention to themselves. Some passengers exchanged quick glances, still shaking their heads in disbelief over the shocking scene that had unfolded just moments earlier. Others were quietly speaking to each other about what they had seen, trying to piece together the story. The mood was heavy, as if everyone knew something bigger was about to happen, but no one could quite predict what it would be. Meanwhile, the flight attendant who had slapped the passenger stood by the exit, nervously fidgeting with her uniform. Her face was pale, and her hands were trembling. She knew the situation had reached a point where there was no going back. She had hoped that perhaps after landing, things would settle down, maybe even be forgotten. But deep down, she had to know that what she had done couldn't just be swept under the rug. Her actions had been witnessed by multiple passengers, and now it was up to the airline to decide how to handle it. As soon as the plane had come to a full stop at the gate, the supervisor was already there, waiting by the jet bridge. She had received a full report on the incident from the ground crew and was prepared to take swift action. She didn't waste any time. The moment the flight attendant stepped off the plane, the supervisor approached her, calmly but firmly. Without a word, she led the flight attendant aside to speak privately. The supervisor's face was cold and unreadable, but the flight attendant could tell by the way she was being escorted that things weren't looking good. The supervisor asked her to explain what had happened. The flight attendant, still shaken, stammered through her version of events. She mentioned the seating dispute, the raised voices, and then the slap. Her voice trailed off as she spoke, realizing that even she couldn't justify what had happened. There was a long pause before the supervisor responded, but it was clear that her mind was already made up. The airline had a zero-tolerance policy for violence, and no amount of explanation could change that. Without hesitation, the supervisor told her, "You're fired. Please collect your things and leave immediately." The flight attendant's face went white, and for a moment she just stood there, speechless. She hadn't expected this. She had hoped for a warning, perhaps some kind of reprimand, but not this. Fired on the spot. She could feel the eyes of the other crew members and passengers on her as she slowly gathered her belongings, realizing the weight of her actions. It was over. Her career in the airline industry had come to an abrupt and unexpected end. But what would happen next? Would the passenger press charges? Would this altercation become a headline? The flight attendant's future was now uncertain, and all she could do was leave the airport and begin to face the consequences of what had happened. The flight attendant's departure from the airport wasn't the end of the story. Far from it. News of the incident quickly spread, and it didn't take long before social media platforms were buzzing with outrage. Passengers who had been on the flight began posting about the shocking altercation, some sharing what they had witnessed, while others speculated about what had led to the slap. The incident quickly became the subject of debate online, with strong reactions from both sides. Some people defended the flight attendant, claiming that the passenger must have provoked her, while others sided with the passenger, saying no matter what happened, there was no excuse for violence. The story made its way to local news stations, and soon it was being picked up by national outlets. Headlines flashed across screens, all focused on the same shocking details. A flight attendant slaps a passenger, and moments later, she's fired on the spot. The passenger, whose name had not been publicly released, eventually spoke to the press. His statement was calm, measured, and filled with frustration. He described the slap as unprovoked and said that he never raised his voice or behaved aggressively. He admitted to being upset about the seating issue, but he insisted that he never intended for things to escalate the way they did. He was still processing what had happened, but one thing was clear. He felt humiliated by the flight attendant's actions. The incident had not only left him physically hurt, but emotionally shaken as well. Meanwhile, the airline faced a massive public relations nightmare. As soon as news of the firing spread, people began questioning the airline's handling of the situation. Some applauded the company for taking swift action, while others felt the firing was too harsh, especially without a full investigation into the circumstances. The airline had issued a brief statement, standing by its decision, emphasizing their commitment to maintaining professionalism and safety for all passengers and crew members. But even within the airline, there were whispers. Was the decision to fire the flight attendant made too quickly? Was there more to the story than the public knew? Some crew members who had worked with the flight attendant for years spoke privately about her, saying she had always been a dedicated employee. They felt sympathy for her, but even they couldn't justify her actions. The company had a reputation to uphold, and there was no room for behavior that crossed the line. As the story continued to unfold, it seemed like everyone had an opinion. Social media was flooded with comments, petitions, and even calls to boycott the airline. People were angry, confused, and divided on what they thought was fair. It was clear that this wasn't just an isolated incident. It was becoming a symbol of something much larger. The question of how far companies should go in holding employees accountable for their actions, and whether a single mistake should cost someone their livelihood. The aftermath of the slap wasn't just a one-time news story. It was turning into a full-blown controversy. And as the media continued to cover it, more details began to emerge, complicating the narrative even further. As the media frenzy surrounding the incident continued, the airline found itself under intense scrutiny from both the public and its employees. The company had hoped that firing the flight attendant would put the matter to rest, but it only seemed to fuel the fire. People were demanding answers. Was the flight attendant's behavior really so unforgivable? Was firing her the right call, or was it a knee-jerk reaction that would have long-term consequences for the airline? A few days later, the airline issued another statement, attempting to clarify their position. They stood firm on their decision to fire the flight attendant, but also expressed regret that the incident had escalated the way it had. They explained that the safety and well-being of their passengers were their top priorities, and that any action deemed violent or unsafe would result in immediate termination. However, the statement also acknowledged that the airline was committed to reviewing its policies and training programs to prevent similar incidents in the future. But the damage had already been done. Some passengers, who had been loyal to the airline for years, began to publicly state that they could no longer support a company that acted so harshly, without fully understanding the context. There were even some calls for boycotting the airline, with people questioning whether they could trust a company that didn't seem to care about the welfare of its employees. On the other hand, some passengers supported the airline's decision, saying that no amount of context could justify the flight attendant's violent reaction. They felt that the airline had done the right thing in sending a clear message that this kind of behavior would not be tolerated. The debate online became heated, with people arguing back and forth, some citing previous experiences with unprofessional flight attendants, others sharing personal stories of feeling disrespected or unsafe while flying. Within the airline, the mood was also divided. The flight attendants who had witnessed the incident were torn. Some believed that the passengers' behavior had indeed been disruptive, and that the flight attendant might have felt overwhelmed or threatened. Others argued that the flight attendant's response was completely inappropriate, and that there were better ways to handle a tense situation. The conflict had also brought attention to a larger issue: customer service within the airline industry. Many people began to question how employees in high-stress environments like airlines should be trained to handle difficult situations. Should flight attendants be given more tools and resources to de-escalate conflicts? Should there be more support for workers who are under constant pressure to meet customer demands while maintaining professional behavior? The incident had opened up a can of worms, sparking debates not just about the specific altercation on Flight 347, but about the broader issues of workplace stress, customer relations, and accountability. What started as a simple argument between a passenger and a flight attendant had turned into a much larger conversation about how we treat each other in high-pressure environments and what happens when one small mistake has far-reaching consequences. As the story continued to unfold, things took an unexpected turn. A week after the incident, new information began to emerge that cast doubt on the initial narrative. The passenger, who had initially remained quiet about the details of the altercation, started speaking out more openly. In an exclusive interview with a local news station, he revealed something that surprised many people. His side of the story was not as simple as the media had initially portrayed it. According to the passenger, the flight attendant's slap wasn't the first act of aggression during the flight. He claimed that, before the slap, the flight attendant had been rude and dismissive when he first asked about the seating issue. He explained that he had tried to calmly discuss the situation, but the flight attendant had snapped at him, making him feel belittled and disrespected. He described the entire interaction as an escalating series of rude remarks, with the flight attendant growing more hostile the longer the conversation went on. The passenger admitted that he had gotten frustrated, but he insisted that he never intended to escalate things physically. He said that after the initial exchange, he had asked to speak with a supervisor to resolve the seating issue, but instead of being heard, he was met with even more hostility. That's when, according to his account, the flight attendant slapped him in what he described as a moment of complete loss of control. The passenger's words painted a different picture, one where he felt he had been provoked, rather than just randomly attacked. This revelation sparked a new round of debate. Some people began to question whether the flight attendant had been under too much pressure, dealing with a difficult passenger, and whether her reaction could have been caused by the stress of the job. Others, however, argued that even if the passenger had been rude, no situation justified physical violence. The airline's decision to fire the flight attendant still stood, but now the public's opinion was split in even more directions. On social media, people began to dig deeper into the story, searching for clues about what might have really happened on the plane. Some users started posting old reviews of the flight attendant, claiming that she had been rude or unprofessional in the past. These posts painted a picture of someone who may have been dealing with more than just a bad passenger on this particular flight. There were even rumors that she had been struggling with personal issues that could have influenced her behavior. Meanwhile, the airline had yet to make any further public statements. They stood by their initial decision to fire the flight attendant, but now they were facing mounting pressure to explain why they hadn't fully investigated the situation before making such a swift move. With the passenger's new account, it seemed as though the story was far more complicated than anyone had imagined. The incident had gone from a simple case of workplace violence to a full-blown public relations disaster. The media was still covering every angle of the story, and the airline's reputation was taking a significant hit. But what was clear now was that both sides had their version of events, and neither of them had the full truth. As the debate over the incident raged on, the airline found itself under mounting pressure not just from the public, but from within its own ranks. The situation had gone far beyond just a single flight, and the company's handling of the matter was starting to be questioned more intensely. Several employees, including flight attendants and pilots, began speaking out anonymously, sharing their concerns about how the airline had responded to the incident. One flight attendant, who had worked for the airline for nearly a decade, spoke to a reporter on the condition of anonymity. "We're all under so much pressure," she said. "It's not just about the passengers, but the company's demands. The expectations are unrealistic. If there's even a small problem, they want us to fix it with a smile, no matter how difficult the situation is." She explained that many of the airline's employees were struggling to balance the demands of the job with the mental and emotional toll that came with it. "It's hard to always be on, and sometimes we snap. This isn't an excuse, but I think people need to understand that we're human too." Her words resonated with many, especially those who had been following the story online. It became clear that the issue of stress and burnout among flight attendants wasn't just a peripheral concern. It was at the heart of what had gone wrong. While the public continued to debate whether the flight attendants' actions were justified, those within the airline industry knew that the real issue was the toxic environment that many of these workers had to endure every day. Meanwhile, the airline's corporate response continued to be viewed as cold and calculating. The company had made its stance clear. The flight attendant's behavior was unacceptable, and they had acted swiftly to fire her. But as the days went on, it became more and more apparent that the company's reaction had been more about damage control than understanding the root causes of the problem. As one flight attendant put it, they care more about their reputation than they do about their employees. This growing backlash wasn't just coming from the crew members themselves, it was also gaining traction among the general public. News outlets began running stories on the pressure flight attendants were under, with a focus on the high-stress nature of the job and the lack of support from airlines. Many were starting to question whether the airline's zero-tolerance policy on violence was a fair approach, or if it ignored the underlying mental health challenges faced by workers in these high-pressure roles. As if the situation couldn't get any more complicated, another angle emerged. It turned out that the flight attendant who had been fired had a history of excellent performance reviews. Colleagues spoke about how she had always been a hard-working and reliable team member. This revelation shook things up. If she had such a strong track record, then what had driven her to react in such a violent way on this particular flight? Was there something more that the airline was overlooking? Was it possible that her actions were the result of something far beyond a simple bad day? The public was no longer just debating whether the slap was justified. They were now questioning the airline's decision to fire the flight attendant without fully considering the full context of the situation. The company was facing intense scrutiny, not only for the slap, but also for its treatment of employees under extreme stress. As the scrutiny on the airline intensified, the issue of employee well-being became impossible to ignore. Public opinion was beginning to shift, and the conversation was moving away from just condemning the flight attendants' actions to questioning the larger corporate practices that may have contributed to the situation. In interviews, many flight attendants spoke about the pressures they faced on a daily basis, pressures that often went unnoticed by passengers and, until recently, by their employers as well. One former flight attendant who had left the airline years before recounted her experience. She explained how long shifts, constant customer complaints, and strict company policies led to a toxic work environment. "We're expected to remain calm, friendly, and accommodating all day, even when people are rude, demanding, or disrespectful," she said. "But no one ever talks about what happens when we break down. The company tells us to smile and be pleasant, but they don't offer enough support for the stress we go through. It's exhausting." Her words seemed to echo the sentiment shared by many others in the industry. For years, flight attendants had been expected to maintain an air of professionalism at all costs, even when faced with unreasonable customers or overwhelming stress. The job itself had changed over time, and not for the better. What was once a job that focused primarily on safety and customer service had increasingly become about maximizing profits. Airlines had slashed budgets, reducing crew sizes and cutting training time, all while adding more flights to the schedule. Flight attendants were now expected to handle more passengers, with fewer resources and less time to deal with complex situations. These growing concerns were starting to get picked up by major news outlets, who began to run in-depth investigations into the airline industry's treatment of its workers. Stories about the increasing rates of burnout, anxiety, and even depression among flight attendants were being published alongside statistics about employee turnover and job dissatisfaction. The revelation that the fired flight attendant had been highly rated in her previous reviews began to take on more significance. If someone with a spotless record could snap under pressure, it raised serious questions about the mental health and well-being of the entire industry's workforce. Was it possible that the airline had been too quick to fire an employee without taking into account the deeper causes of her behavior? Public opinion began to shift. While some still insisted that the flight attendant's violent reaction was inexcusable, many began to express sympathy for her situation. They recognized that she wasn't just a villain in this story. She was a person, an employee under immense pressure. People started calling for the airline to reconsider its policies, not just on violence, but on how it treated its employees as a whole. Shouldn't airlines be more proactive in supporting the mental health of their staff? Shouldn't they offer more resources to help workers deal with difficult passengers and high-stress situations? The incident also prompted a wider conversation about workplace culture in general. Advocates for workers' rights began pushing for more mental health awareness in high-stress industries like aviation. "We don't want to make excuses for bad behavior," one workers' advocate said, "but we need to look at the root causes of these outbursts. A system that demands perfection without providing enough support is bound to break down at some point. It's time for the industry to recognize that employees are human, too." On the other side of the debate, the airline stuck to its guns. Despite the growing calls for empathy and understanding, the company maintained that its actions were justified. The CEO of the airline gave a public interview in which he reaffirmed the company's commitment to customer service and professionalism. "We take incidents like this very seriously," he said. "Our priority is always the safety and well-being of our passengers, and the actions of one individual do not represent the values of our airline." He also stated that the airline had already implemented a series of measures to support employees, including additional training on conflict resolution. But for many, these statements felt like damage control, empty words in response to a much larger issue. As the story continued to evolve, it became clear that this was no longer just about one flight attendant, one slap, or one passenger. It was a window into a broader problem within the airline industry, one that had been simmering for years but had only now been brought to light. The question of whether the flight attendant's firing was justified was no longer the central issue. Now it was about whether the airline, and the industry as a whole, was willing to acknowledge the deeper issues of stress, burnout, and inadequate support that led to this incident in the first place. It was clear that the conversation was shifting, but whether it would lead to meaningful change was still uncertain. The incident had ignited a firestorm of debate, but the real question was whether it would lead to a larger cultural shift within the airline industry, one that treated employees as more than just cogs in a machine, but as people who deserved support, respect, and understanding. And as for the fired flight attendant, her life was left hanging in the balance. The airline had made its decision, but many people were now questioning whether she had been the only one responsible for what had happened. Was she just a victim of a broken system? As the conversation about workplace stress continued to grow, the airline found itself facing not just public backlash, but also legal pressure. The fired flight attendant, who had kept a low profile for a few days after the incident, suddenly began to make her voice heard. She hired a high-profile attorney to represent her, and soon enough, the case took a dramatic turn. The lawyer filed for wrongful termination, claiming that the airline had fired the flight attendant without properly investigating the full circumstances surrounding the incident. In the legal filing, the attorney argued that the airline's rush to terminate the employee was premature, especially considering the fact that she had a solid track record with the company. They emphasized that the company had failed to take into account the stressful working conditions that might have contributed to her outburst. The lawyer even pointed out that, at no point, had the airline offered her any support or counseling to address the stress and anxiety that came with the job. They were making the case that the airline had acted without proper regard for the human factors at play. This legal action added a new layer of complexity to the already tangled situation. Not only was the incident now a public relations nightmare for the airline, but it was also turning into a legal battle that could potentially result in a large settlement or even a court case. The flight attendant's legal team began gathering evidence, including testimonies from former colleagues who spoke about her dedication to her work and her generally calm demeanor before the incident. They also provided medical records showing that she had been dealing with increasing levels of stress due to long hours and a lack of proper support from the airline. As the legal proceedings began to take shape, the media picked up on the developments. News outlets were now reporting on the wrongful termination lawsuit, and the airline's actions were being called into question from a legal perspective. The lawsuit wasn't just about one employee's firing. It was a potential landmark case that could set a precedent for how companies handle situations involving workplace stress and employee mental health. The more the public learned about the airline's handling of the matter, the more sympathy began to shift toward the flight attendant. Many people who had initially sided with the airline now began to question whether the company's zero-tolerance policy for violence was truly fair without taking mental health factors into consideration. The flight attendant's legal team argued that her actions, while regrettable, were not malicious and were the result of a broken system. They suggested that the airline had created an environment that pushed its employees too hard, without providing the necessary tools or emotional support to deal with the pressures of the job. Her lawyer made an impassioned statement saying, "Our client did not lash out because of personal malice or an issue with a passenger. She acted in a moment of extreme stress, and it is clear that the airline, rather than offering support, chose to fire her without any real understanding of the circumstances." Meanwhile, the airline continued to defend its actions, insisting that while they sympathized with the flight attendant situation, violence against passengers could not be tolerated under any circumstances. The CEO once again addressed the public, reiterating that the company had a responsibility to protect the safety of its passengers above all else. "We understand the pressures our employees face, but we must hold all our staff to the highest standards. What happened on Flight 347 was unacceptable, and we stand by our decision," he said. But the more the public and the media delved into the issue, the more people began to feel that the airline's decision was about more than just one incident. It was becoming clear that the company's policies and attitude toward its employees were now under intense scrutiny. The lawsuit had become a focal point in the larger conversation about employee rights, workplace stress, and corporate responsibility. As the case continued to develop, it became clear that the flight attendant's fate was not just about her. It was about whether the airline and other companies in similar industries were ready to face the consequences of their treatment of employees. And then, just as the situation seemed to be heading toward an inevitable court battle, something unexpected happened. The airline, under increasing pressure from both the media and legal community, announced that it would enter settlement talks with the flight attendant's legal team. There was no immediate confirmation of the terms, but it was clear that both sides were now looking to avoid a long, drawn-out court case. Whether this meant a significant settlement or some other resolution, it was a sign that the airline was beginning to realize that there was more to this story than they had originally thought. As the settlement talks progressed, both sides were preparing for the next steps, but tensions were still high. The media continued to closely follow the case, with reporters camped outside the courthouse, eager for any update on the negotiations. With each passing day, More people started to take notice of the underlying issues raised by the incident, issues that went far beyond one flight attendant's outburst. The focus was now squarely on the airline's culture, how they treated their employees, and whether their policies were truly fair in light of the mounting public awareness about workplace stress. The flight attendant's legal team had been smart in making sure the case wasn't just about her. They turned it into a broader conversation about the conditions flight attendants and other airline employees faced daily. This framing resonated with a lot of people, especially those who had worked in high-stress jobs or had experienced poor treatment in customer service positions. Advocacy groups began to rally behind the flight attendant, calling for better workplace protections and more resources for employees who faced the pressures of constant customer interaction without adequate support. Meanwhile, the airline was grappling with the very real threat that this case could set a precedent. If the flight attendant won, it could open the door for more lawsuits from other employees in similar situations. It could force companies to rethink their zero-tolerance policies and challenge their approach to employee well-being. The CEO and the board of directors were facing mounting pressure to resolve the situation without further damaging the airline's public image. They had already lost customers who had been outraged by the firing, and more were now considering whether they wanted to continue flying with a company that didn't seem to care about its employees' mental health. In an effort to get ahead of the growing backlash, the airline decided to make a bold move. They called a press conference to announce a new initiative, a company-wide overhaul of their employee support systems. The announcement included new policies aimed at providing flight attendants with mental health resources, mandatory counseling sessions after high-stress incidents, and more comprehensive training on conflict resolution. They also revealed plans to set up a well-being committee to evaluate the working conditions of all airline employees, with a focus on reducing stress and increasing job satisfaction. The public response was mixed. Some praised the airline for taking responsibility and making an effort to improve its working conditions. They saw it as a step in the right direction, acknowledging that the pressure on flight attendants and many other service industry workers had long been underestimated. Others, however, felt that these new policies were nothing more than a public relations stunt, aimed at diffusing the backlash rather than addressing the core issues. Critics argued that the airline's actions were coming too late, and that they had only acted in response to negative media coverage and the threat of a lawsuit. As the settlement talks drew closer, the tension between the flight attendant and the airline reached its peak. The flight attendant's legal team had made it clear that they weren't just looking for a financial settlement. They wanted an official apology from the airline, a public acknowledgement of the role workplace stress had played in the incident, and a commitment to make real, lasting changes to how they treated their employees. They had positioned themselves as advocates for the entire workforce, not just their client. This was no longer just about getting the flight attendant's job back. It was about forcing the airline to recognize the systemic problems within its corporate culture. And then, after weeks of back-and-forth negotiations, the two parties reached an agreement. The terms of the settlement were kept private, but it was clear that the airline had agreed to make significant changes. They also offered the flight attendant a financial settlement in exchange for dropping the lawsuit. The settlement wasn't a victory for the flight attendant alone. It was a statement that the airline had been forced to face the reality of its own shortcomings. As the story came to a close, the wider implications of the incident began to sink in. The firing of the flight attendant had sparked a larger conversation about the pressures of the job, the need for better support systems for employees, and the importance of addressing mental health in the workplace. The airline's public image had taken a significant hit, but the hope was that this painful chapter would eventually lead to real change in the industry. For the flight attendant, while her career with the airline was over, her fight had opened a door to a conversation that could lead to a better future for her fellow workers. In the aftermath of the settlement, the dust began to settle, but the conversation surrounding the incident didn't disappear. It had sparked something far larger than just one isolated altercation. It had ignited a movement. Advocacy groups for workers' rights, especially those representing airline employees, began using the case as a rallying cry. They called for better working conditions, mental health support, and more resources to prevent incidents like the one on Flight 347 from happening again. The case had shown the public just how fragile the mental state of employees in high-pressure environments could be. And now, the conversation was shifting toward lasting, systemic change. Some of the biggest unions in the airline industry publicly supported the flight attendant, praising her for speaking out and pushing for better standards in the workplace. They used her case to highlight how many flight attendants were struggling under the pressure of long shifts, low wages, and constant customer demands. It became clear that, while the individual incident had been tragic, the real story was about an industry-wide culture that had been ignoring the mental health needs of its workers for far too long. A few months later, the airline industry saw its first signs of change. A major airline based in Europe announced it would be introducing new employee wellness programs for its flight attendants, including mandatory mental health screenings and stress management workshops. This was the first of its kind, and it sent a ripple effect through the industry. Other airlines followed suit, creating their own versions of wellness programs and offering more comprehensive training in conflict resolution and customer service management. These programs didn't just focus on physical safety, they addressed the emotional and psychological demands of the job, acknowledging that flight attendants were not just service providers, but individuals with their own personal struggles, needs, and limitations. However, not everyone was convinced that these changes would be enough. Some critics argued that while these new policies sounded good on paper, they were often just a form of window dressing. "It's all talk and no real change," one former flight attendant said in an interview. "Until they improve the working conditions, reduce the hours, increase the pay, and give us more time off, none of this is going to fix the underlying problems." These critics felt that the airline industry was still overlooking the real causes of burnout and stress, and that true reform would require a more fundamental shift in how airlines operated. Meanwhile, the flight attendant, whose actions had sparked this chain of events, had moved on with her life. While she had received the financial settlement, she knew that her career in the airline industry was over. She didn't want to be remembered solely for the slap, and over time, she began to speak out more publicly about her experience. In interviews, she emphasized that her goal was never to excuse her actions, but to highlight the toxic work environment that had contributed to her breakdown. She had been forced to make a choice between continuing to suppress her emotions and standing up for her own mental health. In the end, her decision to act out had cost her everything, but she hoped that, by speaking out, she could help prevent others from facing the same fate. Despite the criticism she received, the flight attendant became a symbol for many who believed the airline industry needed to do better by its employees. She attended conferences, spoke at industry panels, and even wrote a book about her experience, offering insights into the psychological toll of working in the service industry. Her message was clear. Employers had to start listening to their workers, providing not just better pay but better mental health resources. And while the slap had been an extreme response to years of pressure, it had forced a conversation that many had been avoiding for far too long. The airline itself, though still dealing with the fallout from the incident, had begun to make gradual improvements. While their reputation hadn't fully recovered, the changes they made, along with the public acknowledgement of their role in contributing to the flight attendants' stress, served as a reminder of how important it was to take employee well-being seriously. For the passengers who had witnessed the slap, it had been an unforgettable moment, but for the larger public, it had sparked a movement toward a more empathetic and supportive workplace culture. And while the story of Flight 347 had started as an isolated incident, it had become a turning point in how we think about mental health in high-stress jobs. It reminded everyone that we all have breaking points, and that sometimes the smallest incident can expose the cracks in a system that had long been ignored. The flight attendant's actions might have been a moment of anger and frustration, but in the end, they gave voice to a much larger conversation that was long overdue. Months passed, and the wave of change set off by the Flight 347 incident continued to ripple through the airline industry. But the broader implications of the case were far from resolved. While some airlines introduced wellness programs and started to address the mental health of their employees, the reality was that many of these programs were still in their infancy. The root causes of the stress that led to the altercation on Flight 347, the long hours, the pressure to maintain perfect customer service, the physically demanding nature of the job, remained largely unaddressed. It became clear that the industry had a long way to go before meaningful change was truly realized. The flight attendant, whose name had become synonymous with the incident, continued to speak publicly about the deep flaws in the airline system. She had, in the weeks following the settlement, received a great deal of media attention, but she was determined to use it for more than just personal gain. Her interviews, talks, and public appearances were filled with insights into the realities of the airline industry, and she became an outspoken advocate for service workers who faced similar pressures. Through her advocacy, she was able to paint a picture of the everyday struggles that flight attendants and other service workers dealt with, struggles that had long been ignored by both the public and the companies they worked for. She spoke often about the mental exhaustion that came with the job, how constantly smiling and remaining polite to passengers, no matter how rude or difficult, could take an emotional toll. "I wasn't just dealing with passengers," she said in one interview. "I was dealing with management, with the stress of the job, with the pressure to meet unrealistic expectations, and at the end of the day, it was all just building up." Her honesty resonated with many people who worked in high-stress industries, and her willingness to speak out encouraged others to come forward with their own stories. But it wasn't just about the employees. The passengers, too, were affected by the incident. They had witnessed something shocking, a moment of violence that left them questioning the safety of their own flights. For many, it was a reminder that the people who served them in the skies were not just staff, but human beings, with their own struggles and challenges. Passengers who had been on Flight 347 spoke out in the aftermath, with some offering sympathy to the flight attendant, while others stuck to the original narrative of condemning her actions. But as the months passed, it became evident that the passengers, too, had begun to understand the deeper issues at play. Some passengers took it upon themselves to advocate for better treatment of airline employees. They spoke up on social media, urging airlines to improve working conditions for flight attendants. One campaign, led by passengers who had witnessed the incident, even started a petition calling for the creation of mandatory rest periods for airline staff and better mental health support. "The crew are the ones who make sure we're safe and comfortable, but they're human too," the petition read. It quickly gained traction, with thousands of signatures from passengers who felt that the industry needed a significant overhaul. Despite these movements, the airline at the center of the incident continued to struggle with its reputation. Though it had implemented some changes, including better employee support programs and new conflict resolution training, many people viewed these efforts as too little, too late. The airline's swift firing of the flight attendant without a thorough investigation into the full context of the situation had left a bad taste in the mouths of both the public and its employees. The company's focus on damage control, rather than on truly understanding and addressing the underlying issues, had backfired. Internally, the airline began to face challenges as well. While some employees appreciated the new wellness initiatives, many still felt that the corporate culture hadn't truly changed. They pointed out that the root cause of the stress, high expectations with low support, remained in place. Flight attendants and pilots still faced long hours, short turnaround times, and the constant pressure to maintain a perfect public image. In many ways, the company had simply added a few layers of band-aid solutions without addressing the core problems that led to the situation in the first place. An industry-wide conversation was brewing. Conferences and panels on mental health in the workplace began to feature airline workers, who now had a platform to share their experiences. The flight attendant who had been at the center of Flight 347's controversy became a regular speaker at these events. She wasn't just sharing her personal story anymore. She was speaking for an entire workforce that had been voiceless for far too long. She emphasized the importance of understanding stress in high-pressure jobs and called for real, tangible changes in the way employees were treated. "This isn't just about me," she often said. "This is about every person who has ever worked in customer service, who has been told to keep smiling even when they're falling apart inside. We need to start treating people like people, not machines." Her message struck a chord with many, but change was slow. The conversation was happening, but the systemic changes needed to improve the situation were still not widespread. The hope was that the Flight 347 incident would be the beginning of a larger movement to address workplace stress, but it was clear that this was just the first step in what would likely be a long and difficult journey. Meanwhile, the flight attendant's life had taken on a new direction. Though she would never return to the airline industry, she had found a new calling in advocacy. She had become a symbol for workers everywhere, a reminder of what can happen when an employee's stress is ignored and their humanity is overlooked. The firestorm that began with a single slap had turned into a movement that was still ongoing, and one that had the potential to change the way we think about work, stress, and the human side of customer service. And while it was clear that the battle was far from over, the flight attendant knew that at least in some small way, the world had changed. Her fight was far from finished, but her voice had been heard, and that was a start. As the months stretched on, the conversation that had been ignited by the slap on Flight 347 continued to evolve, rippling through not just the airline industry, but the broader conversation about worker treatment in high-pressure environments. The flight attendant, once a mere employee going about her job, had now become the face of a growing movement for better employee support, mental health awareness, and a rethinking of what it meant to work in customer service. Despite the airline's efforts to improve its internal policies and offer public apologies, the story was far from over. The issues that had been raised by the Flight 347 incident, long work hours, pressure to maintain perfect customer service, inadequate mental health support, were not easily solved with a few new training sessions or wellness programs. Many employees within the airline industry still felt that the root causes of the problem had not been addressed. In fact, while some flight attendants welcomed the changes, others saw the airline's new policies as little more than a public relations gesture, a way to salvage their reputation in the wake of a very public incident. The changes seemed to be reactionary, and many employees were left wondering what had changed for them on the ground, day to day. At the same time, the public was slowly starting to recognize that the story of Flight 347 wasn't just about one incident of violence. It was part of a larger systemic issue. The flight attendant's advocacy work continued to attract attention. She began speaking more widely at conferences and forums, not just in the airline industry, but also in the larger realm of labor rights and mental health in the workplace. She spoke candidly about her experience, but also about the broader cultural shift that needed to happen. "It's easy to point fingers at one person," she said in a keynote speech at a mental health summit. "But the real problem is how we're treating employees across the board, how we're ignoring the mental strain that people are under in these jobs, and how we keep expecting them to just deal with it." Her words resonated with many who had worked in high-pressure service industries, from hotel staff to retail workers, from hospital staff to customer service agents. People from all walks of life began to share their own stories of stress, burnout, and mental health struggles. She was quickly becoming a symbol of those who felt invisible in their own workplaces. And with each story, the pressure continued to build for companies to act not just reactively, but proactively, to address the mental health needs of their employees. But the flight attendant wasn't the only one facing scrutiny. The airline, despite its claims of reform, was finding itself under increasing pressure from labor unions, mental health advocates, and the public to prove that its changes weren't just superficial. One of the criticisms was that the company's new wellness initiatives, while well-meaning, still did not address the larger issue of burnout from the very nature of the work. "Giving a flight attendant a few counseling sessions isn't going to fix the problem," one union leader said. "The job itself is broken. The expectations are too high. The work is too demanding, and the compensation doesn't match the strain it puts on people's lives. Until they fix that, no wellness program will work." The airline's response was telling. They announced a new round of reforms, including additional hours for crew rest and more flexible schedules to reduce burnout. But many employees were skeptical. They wanted real change, not just tweaks to a broken system. There were talks of collective bargaining and potential strikes, as workers began to realize that the industry needed a complete overhaul in its approach to labor. The union's stance became clear. While the airline had taken some steps in the right direction, they would continue to push for more substantial reforms in the coming months, with a focus on better compensation, better schedules, and more meaningful mental health support. Behind the scenes, the flight attendant's legal case had also prompted more change, though this, too, was met with mixed reactions. The lawsuit she had filed for wrongful termination had set a legal precedent, but the industry was still figuring out how to reconcile its zero-tolerance policies with the growing acknowledgement that workplace stress played a significant role in incidents like the one on Flight 347. Some airlines began to review their own policies, debating whether a firmer stance on employee behavior was actually preventing them from addressing the root causes of stress. In a few high-profile cases, employees who had faced significant personal challenges were given second chances after previous infractions, indicating that the industry was starting to entertain a more compassionate approach to disciplinary actions. But while these shifts were taking place, the reality was that the journey toward meaningful change was slow. The flight attendant continued to speak out, advocating for mental health resources, more humane policies, and better working conditions for airline employees. Her advocacy now extended beyond just one airline or one altercation. It was about a larger issue that affected millions of workers in various industries. The broader public had started to listen, but there were still many hurdles ahead. The airline industry, like many others, was built on long-standing traditions and practices that were difficult to change overnight. The media coverage of the case had softened over time, but the legacy of Flight 347 lived on. People were now more aware of the pressures workers faced, and the story had changed the way some viewed service jobs. Where once flight attendants and other customer service employees had been seen as mere faceless workers in uniforms, they were now starting to be viewed as individuals with complex emotions and needs. The discussion had shifted from blaming employees for snapping to understanding the systemic pressures that led to those moments. This was perhaps the most important change of all, the recognition that the people who work in customer service are not just robots programmed to serve, but human beings who, just like everyone else, have their breaking points. And while the immediate aftermath of the incident had been painful for all involved, the long-term effects were undeniable. The conversation that started with a single explosive event on a flight had sparked a broader shift in the way we think about work, stress, and human well-being in the workplace. The flight attendant had become an unlikely hero in a movement that had only just begun. And though the journey was far from over, there was a sense of hope that real, lasting change was on the horizon. The fight wasn't over, but it was no longer just one person's struggle. It had become the fight for a better, more empathetic approach to labor, a fight that would continue until workers everywhere were truly seen and heard, not just for the work they did, but for the people they were. As the months turned into a year, the ripples created by the Flight 347 incident continued to spread. What had started as a shocking, isolated event had become a pivotal moment in the ongoing fight for better working conditions, mental health awareness, and employee rights within industries plagued by high stress and demanding expectations. The flight attendant who had once been the subject of intense scrutiny was now recognized as a trailblazer in advocating for systemic change. The airline itself, while still recovering from the public fallout, had slowly begun to shift its policies. The reforms it had put in place, additional training, new wellness programs, and more flexible scheduling, became more deeply ingrained in the company's culture. Yet, as many had feared, those changes were still in their early stages. The challenges facing employees were not going to disappear overnight. Flight attendants still worked long hours, often under stressful and thankless conditions. But the awareness was now there. Awareness that workers were human, and that their mental and emotional health could no longer be overlooked. The story of Flight 347 had forced the industry to confront this reality. While the airline made incremental progress, the bigger, more systemic changes were happening outside of corporate boardrooms. Advocacy groups and unions continued to push for further improvements, and the flight attendant, now fully embedded in the movement for change, kept speaking out. She traveled across the country and abroad, sharing her story at conferences, universities, and in the media. Her words were no longer just about her own experience, but about the millions of workers in high-pressure, customer-facing jobs who were dealing with the same challenges every day. She spoke about the long hours, the unrelenting pressure to meet customer expectations, the physical toll the job took on workers' bodies, and the lack of support for mental health. She highlighted the importance of creating workplace environments where people could admit when they were struggling, where they could ask for help without fear of being reprimanded or stigmatized. She made it clear that while she regretted her own actions, the real tragedy was that no one had taken the time to listen to her or to any of her colleagues before it was too late. Her advocacy work did not stop at airlines. She began connecting with workers from other industries, retail, hospitality, healthcare, and beyond, who were facing similar struggles. The movement for better workplace conditions had transcended the airline industry. It had become about much more than just one flight attendant's breakdown. It had become a movement for better mental health support, for workplaces where employees were respected not just for their productivity but for their humanity. The conversation about mental health in the workplace began to shift on a global scale. Governments and businesses started to recognize that supporting employee well-being was not just a moral obligation, but an economic necessity. Studies began to show that companies that invested in employee mental health programs saw lower turnover rates, increased productivity, and higher overall satisfaction from their workers. Some businesses began to take proactive steps toward creating healthier work environments, while others were still reluctant, hesitant to change the way things had always been done. But the movement was gaining momentum. The flight attendant's story, while painful, had sparked an undeniable shift in attitudes toward employee well-being. It had forced companies to reconsider their policies and reflect on how they treated their staff, not just as workers, but as people. She became a widely recognized figure, appearing in documentaries, on talk shows, and even writing a book about her journey from employee to advocate. The book, titled Breaking Point: A Flight Attendant's Fight for a Better Workplace, became a bestseller, offering a powerful and personal perspective on the challenges of working in high-pressure environments. The final chapter of her story, however, was not yet written. While she had achieved much, raising awareness, sparking change, and becoming a voice for millions, she knew that the work was far from over. There was still much to be done. For every company that had begun to prioritize mental health, there were still countless others that treated their employees as expendable commodities. And the battle for better working conditions and respect for mental health was ongoing. And so, the story of Flight 347, one that had begun with a single shocking moment of violence, had become a much larger, more enduring story of resilience, change, and hope. It had transformed a moment of crisis into a call for action, and in doing so, had given rise to a movement that sought not only to improve workplaces, but to change how we think about work, stress, and human well-being. The flight attendant had been at the center of this transformation. Though she had lost her job and faced intense personal consequences, she had found a new purpose: fighting for the rights of workers everywhere, and ensuring that no one would have to reach their breaking point alone. Her journey had come full circle, from the chaos of that fateful flight to becoming a powerful advocate for change. And though the battle for workplace reform was far from finished, the flight attendant knew this much: the first step toward a better future had already been taken, and it had started with one person, one moment, and a fight for a better, more humane way to work. If you found this story shocking, make sure to like this video and share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you think. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Thanks for watching.